North Africa, Tunisia. The Russian citizen Anastasia Shirinskaya has spent most of her life here. This elderly woman holds much credit for the continued existence of the Russian temples in a Muslim country. Along with 6,000 refugees from Russia, her family came here with the last squadron of the Russian Imperial Navy in 1920. All that remains of the 33 ships which carried the refugees is a memorial plaque in the temple of Alexander Nevsky. Tunisia is where Anastasia Shirinskaya spent most of her life. For 90 years, she's been a living Russian legend in North Africa. She's the only foreigner whose name has been bestowed on a square in a Tunisian city. Autumn 1920. The civil war is in its third year in Russia, where it started soon after the Bolsheviks performed a coup in October 1917. The Bolshevik Red Army is fighting against the White Army, manned by the supporters of the old regime. 3 years after the war began, the Reds are in control of most of Russia. The Whites are pinned down to the Black Sea coast in the Crimea. They are hoping to pass the winter on the peninsula, recover their strength, and deal the Reds a decisive blow next year in 1921. The White Army is looking to its former World War I allies for help, but the British refuse to deliver, while the French are dragging their feet. On November 9th, 1920, the Bolsheviks invade the Crimea. The Whites have no choice other than to escape by sea. In 1920, Anastasia Shirinskaya was 8 years old. Her father, Senior Lieutenant Alexander Manstein, was in command of a destroyer, the Zharki or the Hot. It was unable to leave under its own power, being in the docks with its engines dismantled for repair.
Daddy was running around imploring the authorities to take the Zharki in tow. They say, "You're a madman." "No," he replied, "I'm not a madman, I'm a sailor." No sailor will ever leave his ship in a port to the invading enemy.
The Bolshevik government made several attempts to destroy the Russian Navy. A mass-scale extermination of naval officers began practically in the wake of the October 1917 coup. Many survivors joined the White movement. By late 1920, the Whites managed to put together in Crimean ports an impressive squadron of ships, including battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. In November 1920, they were covering the evacuation of the White movement supporters.
I remember the good teamwork, how people were rapidly boarding the ships. But panic? No. This, I don't remember at all.
A plan to evacuate the army, the military, and civilian establishments from the Crimea to Constantinople was ready as early as 6 months prior to the November disaster. Tens of thousands of people were accommodated on board ships within less than a week. It wasn't only themselves, their families, and their soulmates that the Russian officers were saving. They were also saving the combatant ships of the Russian Imperial Navy. The last Russian squadron included a submarine, the Udka or the Duck, under Captain Second Rank Nestor Monastryov. In his memoirs, he writes that he was given the order to hoist the French flag as he was leaving Sevastopol. France took the remnants of the Russian Navy under its patronage.
126 ships left Sevastopol with 150,000 people on board. They reached Constantinople. They were not fleeing, it was an orderly retreat from Russia, and they were saving the ships.
In November 1920, when the white ships were trudging across the Black Sea, a force 7 gale was throwing them one upon the other. The ships were overloaded. However, just 2 ships didn't manage to reach Constantinople. One was captured by Bolshevik supporters, the other went missing at sea.
The Zhivoy, a destroyer, was lost. Gales were raging in the Black Sea. The Zharki, my dad's ship, went in tow because its engines were dismantled. This is why my dad was taking some other ship to Constantinople.
By mid-November 1920, more than 100 ships wearing the Russian colors were laid out in Turkish Constantinople's roadstead. Quarantine was announced. The Turkish and French authorities were deciding what was to be done with tens of thousands of refugees from Russia. But the Russians didn't consider themselves as either refugees or émigrés. They had made an orderly retreat before superior enemy forces, while retaining all of the attributes of a regular army. At that time, no one doubted that a victorious comeback would follow the temporary retreat. The combatant ships had to wait for several weeks before their fate was decided. The crews and families were hoping that France would be their last destination. But the French authorities suggested the anchorage should be at the port of Bizerte in French-controlled Tunisia. To assure repayment of refugee accommodation costs, the French took the entire remaining Russian Navy and merchant fleet as collateral.
We left Sevastopol on board the Zharki, the destroyer my dad was in command of. In Constantinople, all sailors' families were ordered to board another ship. We came back to my dad and the Zharki at Bizerte.
Early in the morning on December the 23rd, 1920, 2 days before Christmas, the first group of Russian ships reached the Bizerte harbor. They were flying the French colors on their mastheads and Russian St. Andrew flags. For many, it was the first time since August 1914 that they had managed to dock. No one doubted that the Bolshevik mutiny would soon be crushed and the crews with their ships would come back home. The first toast on New Year's Eve in 1921 was to a speedy return. They didn't know at the time that they would have to spend the next 4 years on their ships.
A late 19th century battleship, the St. George, was moored at Bizerte. I have a drawing of it here. The sailors stayed back on the ships, while the families were transferred to the St. George.
Bizerte was founded by the Phoenicians about 3,000 years ago, long before Carthage. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder called Bizerte a tranquil town, keen to maintain its calmness and attracting numerous Roman noblemen with its fresh, tender climate. Nearly 2,000 years old, this description still holds true today. Many ships call it this conveniently located, hospitable port while en route across the Mediterranean.
This is the place where the old battleship, the St. George, was moored. The Russian families lived there.
When Russian ships entered Bizerte at the end of 1920, a quarantine was imposed. The families and crews were banned from going ashore. The French authorities were afraid of Bolshevism. As it transpired from their reports to France, the Bizerte gendarmerie heads were absolutely sure that the majority of 5,400 Russians who arrived in Tunisia shared the Bolshevik ideas. At Bizerte, the Russians were soldiering. Combat training exercises took place regularly. Ships were given servicing and maintenance. Viktor Leonidov, head of archives at the Russian Culture Fund, ploughed through a huge amount of white emigration documents, including some related to the Bizerte squadron. He believes the most surprising thing in the Russian squadron's history is how the Russians were able to establish a business-as-usual environment, even in Africa.
Each day they go through the motions of hoisting the St. Andrew ensigns. They publish journals. They run a sea cadet corps. They maintain a penal system, complete with naval detention barracks. They have sick bays on board and ambulatory churches. And they make frameworks for icons out of empty tin cans.
It was impossible for the Russian sailors and their families to adapt to the local lifestyle because of the French quarantine and total poverty.
We lived in our Russian circle. We had parties. We celebrated our Russian feasts. Children studied Russian history.
The Russians, as usual, exchanged visits, celebrated Easter, Christmas and New Year. They held dancing balls and, in general, it was as though they were living on firm ground somewhere in St. Petersburg or Moscow, instead of on ships in a North African port. In the meantime, the French government gradually relaxed the quarantine. The funding for the squadron was being cut down as well. The French authorities insisted that increasingly more people should be decommissioned. By summer 1922, the squadron's strength was reduced to 500 people. The rest had to look for housing and a means of livelihood on shore.
My mother never complained. She worked as a servant for other people. She said she wasn't ashamed to clean someone's house, honestly, and have a respectful attitude to a job that helped her feed and educate her children.
The Russian colony at Bizerte was shrinking, but as long as the ships with the St. Andrew flags were at Bizerte harbour, many still hoped against hope that they would soon be home. This hope vanished on October the 29th, 1924. Bizerte is a port town on the Mediterranean coast. The Russians came here at the end of the 1920s, after the Civil War was over, on the last ships of the Russian Emperor's fleet. More than 5,000 seamen, along with their families, didn't believe in the future of Bolshevik Russia. The Russians were lucky. During the several thousand years of its existence, the people of Bizerte had become used to a mix of races and languages. However, before they started to adapt in their new environment, they had to face another tragedy related to the motherland they had left behind.
Those ships belonged to the Russian Empire. It was a very hard day when their St. Andrew's flags went down for the last time ever.
The St. Andrew flag is the symbol of the Russian Emperor's navy. For 3 centuries, Russian sailors swore allegiance, fought, died, and won beneath it. Seeing Russian warships hold down their St. Andrew flags, the Russians in Bizerte realized they shouldn't expect to return home soon, if ever. There was no Russia anymore and no place for them to return to. Many fresh tombs bearing Russian names appeared at the Christian cemetery in Byzantium.